Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Lord Mayor of Leicester, councillors from the local authority, distinguished elders, brothers and sisters, comrades and friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to begin by thanking the police and the security who eased my way in here and who are protecting us all from the foolish chatter on the internet last night from fascist organizations that they would attempt to disrupt this meeting today. I don't think that they will, but I'm sure that if anyone tried, the combination of our own strong young men and the police officers who are here to protect us will keep everyone safe, and so there is no need for alarm. As the old wartime saying went, keep calm and carry on working for Palestine, because that's what we are about here today, and so petty politics need not detain us. Secondly, I'd like to thank my brother Yusuf and his World Charity Organisation for not just this event, but the absolutely indefatigable work that Yusuf has performed for Palestine and many other causes over as long as I have known him, and much longer than that. I have a soft spot for Batley for many reasons. One of those is my parliamentary colleague, Mike Wood, a man deserving of the title Member of Parliament, and I hope he continues to be the Member of Parliament here for many years. But the second is Yusuf. Some of you know the story, others don't. It's worth repeating. Of my first encounter with Yusuf, it took place in the desert around Al-Alamein, where my own grandfather fought in the 8th Army in the Second World War. It was dawn, light was just breaking, the mist was just clearing, and I was moving in between the vehicles, checking that everything was okay. We were on our way to Gaza on an epic convoy of hundreds of vehicles to break the siege on Gaza. A man who was dressed, I thought, in the half-light in a North African way, advanced towards me with a plate of hot food. And I said, thank you very much, are you Libyan? And he answered, I'm from Batley. And that was, of course, Brother Yusuf, and we have been fast friends ever since. And he was, I think, on every single one of the convoys that I organized. He was on many convoys that he organized himself, and now he's taken even to going without convoys, just to show his personal and absolute commitment to the breaking of the siege on Gaza and the alleviation of the suffering of the Palestinian people and the solidarity with their struggle for their national rights and the right to self-determination, and to see the day, which we hope one day that we will see, when the Palestinian people are free and their country is returned to the map, and Jerusalem can once again be a place of pilgrimage for all of us. I'm going to speak about Palestine historically as well as contemporaneously, because I've kindly been allocated quite a decent amount of time. But I want to, especially for the journalists present, for I know they haven't come here to hear about the history of the Palestinian people, or even the history of the last 4 weeks, but only the history of the last 4 days. So I want to make some remarks, if I may, about another little controversy in which I have found myself following events at Oxford University on Wednesday evening. I want to make one thing abundantly clear. As far as I'm concerned, Israel is a racist apartheid state. And I will have no truck whatsoever with a racist apartheid state. I didn't when we had another racist apartheid state called South Africa. I wouldn't buy South African oranges. I wouldn't shake hands with supporters of apartheid from South Africa. I wouldn't share a platform with supporters of apartheid in South Africa. I wouldn't talk to their racist apartheid media. And so why should I act any differently with the racist apartheid state of Israel? It's really not rocket science. The only way that we can peacefully contribute to the struggle of the Palestinian people is to boycott Israel absolutely. And that means that if someone comes from Israel to speak in a debate in support of racism and apartheid, they will not be speaking to me. They no doubt can find other people that they can speak to. And if they want to speak to the Palestinians about Palestine, well, the address is the PLO. Only the PLO can speak for the Palestinian people, not me, not David Cameron, not anybody else. The address of the Palestinian people is Palestine Liberation Organization. And any Israelis who want to speak about Palestine should address their conversation there. Of course, if someone is a citizen of Israel but rejects the racist apartheid state, that's a different matter. Sheikh Ra'ad Salah, who was shamefully held in British custody for many months before winning his court case and asserting his right to be here on a visa granted to him by the British consulate in Jerusalem, is a very important leader of the Muslim population in what they call Israel. He carries an Israeli passport. It would be absurd of me to refuse to speak with him, debate with him, fraternize with him, and of course I never would. Equally, the brave Jewish Israeli professor Ilan Pappé, now teaching at Oxford but formerly from the University of Haifa, is a friend, a brother, a comrade to me, because though he carries an Israeli passport, he absolutely rejects the racist apartheid state of Israel. Neither is it a question of someone's religion. Some ignoramuses on the Twitter feed seem to fail to grasp this. None of us here are against Jews. It is haram, forbidden, to be against Jews. The Jews are people of the book. We have to believe in them and their book. It is obligatory on us to do so. We are not against Jews. We are against the political creed of Zionism, because we believe that Zionism is a racist and apartheid creed. So, the idea that I wouldn't debate with Jews, or with Jews, debate with others, or fraternize with Jews, is just absurd. Some of the greatest Jews who ever lived are with us in this struggle. Professor Albert Einstein, the greatest scientist who ever lived, was invited in 1948 to be the first president of Israel. And he refused, saying, I could never be the president of a country whose happiness is to be built upon the misery of another people. He rejected Zionism, the greatest, possibly the greatest of all Jews of all time. Einstein was one of us. Professor Noam Chomsky from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, is possibly the most effective critic of Israel in the world today, and he's Jewish. Professor Norman Finkelstein, witch hunted out of his job in academia in the United States of America, is one of the most effective allies that we have in this struggle. And he's Jewish. And there are many, many others. We reject the false synonym that Jew equals Zionist. Many Jews are not Zionists, and most Zionists are not Jews. Most Zionists are Christian fundamentalist fanatics in the United States, if you want to do the maths. Or people like George W. Bush, or David Cameron, or William Hague. They're Zionists, but they're not Jews. And Chomsky is a Jew, but he's not a Zionist. So this is nothing to do with religion. I would never refuse to speak to someone because of their religion. I would never refuse to speak to someone because it was their misfortune to have to carry an Israeli passport. But if you come to England as an Israeli citizen to speak against the Palestinian people's rights and to support the Zionist, racist apartheid state, you won't be speaking to me. Boycott, boycott, boycott. That has to be our answer to Zionism, because that's all that we can do. We can't fight. We can't give our blood. So we must give what we can. And what we can is to boycott all Israeli goods, services, and all of their apologists, including their media, to which I have not spoken. These many decades past. So that's all I had to say about Oxford University. I appreciate it's not a great moment here in Batley. You're not fixated on the goings on in Christ Church College, in the gleaming spires, amidst the gleaming spires of Oxford University. But for the journalists here, I wanted to make these things clear. But I'm here principally to speak about Palestine, which I believe to have been the victim of one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century and now bleeding into the 21st. And I mean literally bleeding. Just today and yesterday, at least 5 Palestinians have been killed and at least 75 have been wounded in the West Bank alone, by Israeli fire, by Israeli settler fire, and by other means. This is a daily occurrence in Palestine. It doesn't make the news. There has been more coverage from Time magazine to CNN and all around the world of me walking out of a little student meeting in Oxford than there would be for the death of a dozen or even 5 dozen Palestinians in the occupied territories or living alongside them. This great crime in which Palestine has been wiped off the map. We're always hearing talk about people threatening to wipe Israel off the map. But the only country that has been wiped off the map in the Middle East is Palestine. Its people have been scattered to the 4 winds. 800,000 of them were expelled from their homes and their lands more than 60 years ago. That 800,000 has now become millions of people. Their children, their children's children, now their children's children's children have lived with the key to their houses, the maps and title deeds of their lands under their mattresses in refugee camps in which they live in indescribable squalor. Millions of them. They want to talk about terrorism. The wonder is that there are not more Palestinians fighting Israel. Not that some are ready to do so. After all, what would you do if somebody kicked you out of your house, cleared you off of your land, drove you across an international border and told you you must stay there for the rest of your family's history? And that foreigners would come from America, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, France, anywhere, and would come and live in your house and play in your garden and pick your oranges whilst you rotted in a refugee camp along with your children, and their children also. Would you accept it? Well, the Palestinian people decided long ago that they would never accept it. They would not go into the museum of ex-nations. They would insist that they exist and therefore must resist. That's what marks them out from some other peoples. Otherwise, we could go and visit them in the museum. We could look at their costumes and their artifacts, and we could wonder at this civilization now extinct. But Palestine is at the center of the news and the political agenda for one reason only. Because there are lots of hard cases, lots of tragedies, lots of suffering in the world. Palestine is at the center of the news and political agenda because its people resist and refuse the fate of ex-nationhood. And the first thing that has to be said and understood here in Britain is that Britain is responsible for all of this. People ask me why, as a British politician, I have dedicated now more than 35 years of my life to this cause. Well, it's not least because it was Britain that caused it. And I have sat in the British Parliament now for a quarter of a century. For almost half of my life I've been an MP. And every day I have to walk past the room in which this entire tragedy was written, was authored, in our name. Not all of you were here then. Your families weren't here then. You don't share any kind of collective responsibility for it. But it happened in our parliament, in our country. Our foreign minister, on behalf of one people, promised to a second people the land of a third people. It's unique, actually, even in imperialist history. Not least because Britain didn't even possess Palestine as an imperial possession at the moment that it gave it away to somebody else. Now, none of the three people, of course, were consulted. The British people were not asked if they wanted to be the author of what would become a colonial tragedy lasting for the best part of a century and be the cause of so much bloodshed and so much hatred in the world. If we had been asked, we might have said no. Secondly, the Jewish people were not asked. The Zionist leaders who came in front of Balfour and asked him to give them Palestine didn't represent but a tiny scintilla of the Jews in the world at that time. Most of the Jews in the world at that time when the Balfour Declaration was made were progressive, and political cream of Europe. They didn't want to go and live in Palestine. They didn't want to go and displace the Palestinian people. They insisted, no, we are British. We may be Jews, but we are British Jews. We are French Jews. We are Russian Jews. Just like there are British Catholics and British Protestants, we are British Jews. Why should we go and live in Palestine? Not least because it requires endless suffering and war in order for us to do so. That point is particularly paradoxical because many of you may not know that of the Zionist leaders who appeared in front of Balfour, every single one of them was an atheist. That's important because nowadays we're told they have a right to Palestine because of something written in the Bible, as if God was an estate agent giving people's land away. But none of them mentioned the Bible when they appeared in front of Balfour because none of them believed in the Bible. In fact, they weren't even committed to Palestine for their colony. In fact, they negotiated with the British for years about having their state of Israel in Uganda, for example. They had quite advanced negotiations with the British about being given Uganda to found their state of Israel. They negotiated with the British for the Seychelles. They negotiated with the Spanish for Patagonia in Argentina. Can you believe it? They were ready to build their state of Israel in Argentina. That's how little their commitment was to the Bible that they now tell us gives them the title deeds for other people's land. They didn't care where the British gave them or any of the other colonial powers gave them. They just wanted to found another European colonial state. This is very important to know. Israel is a European settler state. No more, no less. Of course, there are now Jews from Eastern countries and from Africa and from China calling themselves Semitic people. I mean, Sammy Davis Jr. was Jewish, but he wasn't a Semite. He was an American black. There are Chinese Jews, Ethiopian Jews. I could become a Jew. You could become a Jew. Would that give you a right to go and live in Palestine? Yes, actually it would, according to the laws of Israel. That's how absurd it is. It's a colonial state just like the other European colonial states. Like Rhodesia was, like South Africa was, like Namibia was, and other white European colonial states. And it must be rejected and resisted on those grounds at the very least, because the days of colonial rule surely ought to be over. But when the British promised Palestine to the Zionists, the people who were least of all consulted were, of course, the Palestinian people themselves. Nobody even told them the discussions were taking place, can you believe it? Balfour was meeting the Zionist leaders without the Palestinians even knowing that their land was being discussed between two groups of Europeans and promised by one of those groups to the other. Only later did they realize, when the British came towards the end of the First World War, that they were to be ready to be colonized like Zimbabwe, like South Africa and other colonial states. And so Britain bears primary historic responsibility for this crime. And every day I have to walk past the room in which this crime took place. I promise you, if you know as much about Palestinian suffering as I do, it's quite difficult to walk past that room without feeling a sense of rage and indignation at the crime that was committed therein. Of course, the British Empire waned. The sun, which never used to set on the British Empire, because God would never trust the British in the dark, did in fact set, although Cameron and Blair before him are busily trying to refloat the British Empire again and rewrite the history of that empire. And as our sun set, the American sun rose. And America took on the responsibility, amongst other things, of being the banker, the armorer, and the diplomatic and political protection squad of the Zionist state, because it suited American strategic interests to have a little loyal European colonial state in the Middle East, right bang in the middle, between the Maghreb and the Mashriq, between the West and the East of the Arab world, which had become so important strategically, economically, religiously, to have a superpower armed by the hyperpower in the middle of such a sea of Muslims, principally hundreds of millions of Arabs, and further afield, Iranians, Afghans, Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladeshis, to have this superpower bristling, as it now turns out, with hundreds of nuclear weapons, was a very important strategic asset for the United States empire. And thus the history of the Palestinian people has proceeded as the victims of first British and then American colonialism, imperialism. And you all know the result. The Palestinians have lost almost all of their country. That which remains of their country has been illegally occupied for 45 years. 45 years. This debate the other night at Oxford was entitled, "Should Israel withdraw from the West Bank?" I said in my 10 minutes, before the other fellow got up to speak and I learned he was an Israeli, I said, this will only take 60 seconds. It's a matter of international law. There's no need for Oxford University to adjudicate on this matter. The United Nations Security Council decided in 1967 that Israel must withdraw from the West Bank and all occupied territories. Resolutions 242 and 338. They didn't give Israel the right to quibble about the conditions under which it will withdraw from the West Bank. It didn't give Israel permission to break international law further by building illegal settlements in the West Bank, by annexing Jerusalem in the West Bank, by separating Jerusalem from the West Bank, by bringing in Israeli settlers and deporting Palestinians, all of which is illegal under international law. Full stop. There's nothing to debate about that. Nothing at all to debate about that. But if they were in Jerusalem, they're now annexed. If they were living in the Golan Heights, they're now annexed. If they're in the West Bank, they're now settled. with the apartheid wall, security fences, hundreds of military checkpoints, all the paraphernalia of an apartheid state. Show us your pass. You're not entitled to be here. Your place is over there. You live here and your farm is there. Hard luck, we just built an apartheid wall between your house and your land. And you can go and whistle. And of course, if you dare to raise your hand or even your voice against it, Israel's clear that it will crush, kill, torture, imprison for year after year, decade after decade, anyone who stands up against its illegal occupation. Or you could be even more unfortunate in some ways. You could be a Palestinian living in Gaza. If you're a Palestinian living in Gaza, what's your lot in life? Your lot is to be 1.8 million people locked up in a territory the most densely populated on the earth. 21.3 miles long, in some places 3.1 miles wide, where every entrance and every exit is controlled by the people who took your country and kicked you there into a little piece of desert called the Gaza Strip. And every one of those entrances is locked. You can't get out. And when the bombs and the rockets start to come down, when the phosphorus gas starts to drop amongst you, when they're firing at you from the sea, the land and the air, there's nowhere to run, there's nowhere to hide. You're in the biggest prison camp in the world, as David Cameron called it. Of course, there was one gate that wasn't directly controlled by the colonial state. And that gate is called Rafah. But it might as well have been, because it was controlled until less than 2 years ago by Hosni Mubarak, the brutal dictator of Egypt. On that trip in which I met my brother Yusuf, some of you will know, we literally had to fight our way into Gaza with our hundreds of trucks and our 500 or more people who'd come all that way to deliver aid to the people in Gaza, because the soldiers and the policemen and the thugs of the Mubarak dictatorship refused to allow us to pass. I myself was arrested, along with my comrade Ron Mackay, by the Mubarak dictatorship, bundled into a vehicle, driven off into the night, ended up at the airport, bundled onto an aeroplane. And as I was getting onto the aeroplane, a little man from the Mubarak Foreign Ministry stepped forward and said, "Mr. George Galloway, you are now persona non grata. You will never enter Egypt again, ever." I replied to him, "Ever is a long time. But here's my prediction, that the day will come when I will be back in Egypt, and the tyrant for whom you are working will be behind bars, awaiting execution for his crimes against the people of Egypt, as well as the people of Palestine." That was one of my better predictions. I'm predicting that Bradford City will win the FA Cup tomorrow by 2-1. Let's hope that prediction turns out to be as accurate. But until the fall of Mubarak, and according to what Yusuf has just told me, even until now, there is no free passage for Palestinian people in and out of the Gaza Strip, neither is there free passage for all the goods, medical equipment, food, building materials, and so on that are desperately needed in Gaza. Most unlucky of all are the Palestinians living in the refugee camps in the Arab countries alongside Palestine. Because the rotten Arab regimes who rule almost every Arab country, almost without exception, from one end to the other, have collaborated with Israel in the suffering of the Palestinian people. Some of them have even signed surrender peace treaties, as they call them, with the Israeli imperial colony. Some of them have Israeli embassies in their capitals. Some of them secretly have Israeli embassies in their capitals. Some of them pretend to be big revolutionaries, like Qatar, for example, which is busily telling us how much it supports the revolution in Syria, whilst having an Israeli embassy in Doha and giving oil and gas at a subsidized price to Israel, whilst it kills and oppresses the Palestinian people under its occupation and under its siege. But those Palestinians who live in their millions in these camps alongside Israel are determined upon one thing, and that one thing is their right to return to their homes. That's why the so-called two-state solution isn't a solution at all. Because the vast majority of Palestinians don't come from the West Bank and Gaza. The vast majority of Palestinians come from what they call Israel, and they have a right to go back to what they call Israel. That's why I fight for not a two-state non-solution, but one democratic state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, where the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians live as equal citizens under the law. One man, one woman, one vote. What could be wrong with that? That's what we insist upon in Batley for ourselves. It's what we insisted upon in South Africa when apartheid was defeated there. Why should we accept anything less for the Palestinian people, either there or scattered around the world? So that brings us up to date. The question is, what are we going to do about it? I'm not going to label this point to you because you came here. But not everyone is here. There's 10,000 Muslims alone in Batley. There's not 150 people here. So where are the others? Well, you need to tell the others. You need to tell them this story. And Yusuf is my witness. When we were there, I met a young girl, now 12 years old, then 9 years old, wearing a hijab, like some of the young girls here today. She was standing in the ruins of her house. Her house had just been struck the day before by Israeli missiles, which killed her mother, her father, and all 5 of her brothers. She happened to be at her grandmother's house, and though she bitterly regretted it, she had survived. The only survivor in her family, an orphan, standing in the ruins of her house, with tears rolling down her face. This is what she asked me, and it's what I'm asking you, and it's what you have to ask the 9,000
850 Muslims in Batley who are not here today. She asked me this. She said, where is this ummah that they talk to us about in school? Where is this ummah that they tell us about in the mosque? She was 9 years old. Where is this ummah that they tell us about in the mosque? Why did they leave us to face this alone? What did we do to deserve to be left to face this alone? I had no answer to her. I don't think you have an answer. But one thing's for sure, we certainly can't leave it to the kings and the princes and the emirs and the presidents in this ummah. We won't be asked on the judgment day what this king or that prince did. We'll be asked what we did. What did we do when this girl was crying in the ruins of her home, above the freshly dug graves of her entire family? We'll be asked what we did. You'll be asked what you did after Galloway told you that story. What did you do? Not what somebody else did. And so it's up to you. Are you going to support Yusuf's charity work or not? That's what I'm here for. I didn't come here to entertain you. I'm on my way back to London, to Wembley. I have many things to do today. I didn't come here to entertain you. I came here to confront you with your responsibilities as that young girl confronted me with mine. That's all. Wassalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.